Hi, thank you so much for joining me on The Same Drugs. I really appreciate it. I'm looking forward to talking with you.
Yeah, thanks for inviting me on. This is great.
So you've, as you know, recently published a new book, which is, I'm just going to hold it up here so people can see what it is here. Undoctrinate. I wonder, what was it that first brought your attention to this issue of what was happening in terms of, maybe we could call it like politicization in the classroom? Was there some incident where you started to be like, oh, something's changing and I'm not sure I feel comfortable with this?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are a couple of answers to that question. The most recent precipitating factor was that I experienced this as a parent with my younger daughter who was in a private school. And my observation is that this problem is more fully advanced in private schools and also in some of the more affluent public schools. And I write about that a little bit in the book. I don't go into all of the incidents that happened because some of them honestly strain credulity. But the story that I talk about specifically, and incidentally, I have been familiar with this problem for years. I mean, I experienced it some as a graduate student. So when I saw it again happening in K-12, I was very aware of the ideology behind it. But what happened to my daughter was the one incident that I focus on is that she was given a copy of the Communist Manifesto to read, which I was fine with because it's a really important book. And then she was asked to participate in a classroom roundtable where they debated the merits of capitalism versus communism. And her class decided that communism was a better economic system than capitalism. And my daughter came home. She was the one student who tried to stand up. She said, I tried to stand up for capitalism, but unfortunately, they didn't give me anything to read about. And she was really upset because she said, I couldn't do it. And then they went around the class and the students they basically labeled her evil because that was the language that they had used, been taught to use in class, which is another interesting aspect about this idea that, it's sort of this good, bad, uh, heavenly, evil morality, this binary where everything is judged in this, these Manichaean terms. And so when I went to the school to discuss it with them, which was the real deal breaker, was they just lied about it and said it had never happened. When I knew perfectly well that it had. And many parents across the country, and this is why so many are showing up at school board meetings, this seems to be a component of what's happening is deceit between school and home, which is so disappointing and is so, is such a breach of trust, which is one of many reasons why parents are showing up so frustrated and downright angry at these school board meetings.
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm always trying to be transparent when I'm talking about these issues because that kind of perspective was my perspective as a teenager when I was in university for a really long time until quite recently. I remember actually in university being in a classroom and the prof asking if, I think it was something like, is there anyone here who thinks that it's like immoral or bad to make money? And I was like, yes. And not everybody agreed with me. So I don't think things had gone so far maybe at that point. This probably would have been in like, I don't know, maybe 2008 or 2009 or something like that.
Right.
And my dad was a Marxist, and I thought that owning property was bad. So, but I had gotten that more from home than from school. So I think at some point things started to change because I do think things were more neutral. When I was a kid or a teenager, like I remember having a debate in high school that was like, what's better, capitalism or communism? And I thought communism was better, but I was in the minority.
Yeah.
But it sounds like that's not the case anymore.
Well, and just the fact that you called it a debate is a really good thing, because I'm perfectly okay with kids stating what they think are their point, what their point of view is, and then hearing opposing sides. That's how it's supposed to be. But clearly, this was a manufactured scenario where, it was tilted in one direction. It was a completely disingenuous learning exercise. And then they, on top of it, the coup de grace was the lying about it afterwards, which indicates that they knew that they were up to something no good. And the keeping of secrets between school and home is, annoying at minimum and downright creepy at most. Because there really is no reason for an adult to share secrets with children behind their parents' backs. And so we've seen parents coming and saying that this smacks of grooming behavior. And, we're seeing this rising, really, contempt for parents, which is something I feel like it's been there for a while. But what's interesting is that some teachers are starting to say the quiet part out loud. And it's kind of coming out into the open now. And that's pretty shocking. There was a teacher in Utah who was fired on the first day of school, and she wasn't a new teacher. And she told the class that you don't have, she wanted them to get vaccinated, and she's of course not a medical doctor. She told the class, you need to get vaccinated, and I don't care what your parents think, because your parents are stupid, and you don't have to do what your parents say. And and then she said, go ahead and tattle on me to the administration, because they're not going to do anything anyway. Well, in this case they did, so they called her bluff. And she also had the nerve. What was the other thing she told? Oh, she said, and if you don't agree with them, you better keep your mouths shut, because I'm just going to go ahead and make fun of you. And, again, just saying the quiet part out loud. And so this is fascinating that, and I think students just know that. And I honestly don't believe that most of the students who do say that they support whatever it is that the teacher is obviously leaning, she's obviously leading them in a certain direction. And I think the students just say it to get it over with quickly. Or some of them, unfortunately, probably don't know any differently, or they just want to get a good grade. I mean, students are learning to be disingenuous in class too. So the whole thing just becomes an exercise in, how to be completely dishonest, which is a terrible education for students in a free country where we're supposed to be honestly sharing ideas and disputing them with one another to reach the resolution, to reach an agreement, or a cultural resolution on ideas of controversy, right? But if everybody's lying, what are we doing? And in a free society, why are people lying? Because of fear of the consequences.
Yeah. And I mean, it's not teaching kids to think for themselves. It's teaching kids to repeat as I say.
Or
right?
I used to call this, when I was in high school, guess what I'm thinking. Which is, it used to just be bad questioning technique. And I can remember sometimes being guilty of doing that as a teacher. It's a real skill to learn how to ask questions well in a way that enables students to think and to not jump in and answer the question for them. But yeah, it's way beyond that now. It's just well, actually, I was at a conference recently, and students are coming forward and starting to organize the same way that parent groups are. And one of the students is working on an article, and basically he said, my teacher doesn't care my teacher doesn't want to hear what I think. My teacher only wants to hear what she thinks. And I'm just supposed to say that to her so that she feels good about, and then she thinks she's done her job. But, there's this thing called Bloom's taxonomy, which is levels of learning activities. And the lowest level is just repetition or memorization. We used to call it regurgitation. How hard is it to just say back exactly what the teacher said to you? It's not hard at all. And I used to get in trouble as a new teacher for having too many exercises that were low level. But this is, they really think that they're doing something high level, but this is at the lowest possible. It's so shallow.
It's funny because I think what's happened, just from observation and then also based on what I read in your book, it seemed to me that it seems like teachers sort of have developed an overblown ego. So I think that a lot of teachers sort of maybe think they're more intelligent or more important than they actually are. And I'm not saying like all teachers are stupid or unimportant, but I mean they've started to think that it's their job to create these little activists that are going to change the world, and that's going to be their all thanks to them, and they're going to infuse their opinions, which of course are all the right opinions, into these kids. And like as we just mentioned, they aren't teaching kids or young people to think for themselves. I mean, it should be their jobs, I think, to provide students with information, to teach them history, to teach them to problem solve. Again, to think things through for themselves and to assess information in a critical way. But instead, it's like they've, I don't know if you're familiar with this rant by Norm Macdonald. I just listened to it recently after he died, but he goes on this rant sort of making fun of this idea that's really become popularized in our Western culture, which is that teachers are the real heroes. And he's like, are they really? Are they the real heroes? I mean, you're a teacher. Like, it's an important job, but it's not a heroic job. But I think teachers have maybe taken that to heart. And it seems to have created an unhealthy kind of dynamic in the classroom.
Yeah, there is this kind of messianic zeal behind some of these ideologies that are being imported, which is maybe a separate discussion. I call this role inflation in the book. I write something like, you've heard of grade inflation. Well, meet role inflation. This is where teachers take their job. And, I think we have a lot of K-12 teachers who think they're college professors. And they'll be like, my classroom. And that's another thing that's really on my nerves. Every week it's different what's on my last nerve. But this idea that it's in my classroom, this, that, and the other. Well, the classroom in a public school really belongs to the public. They're the ones who paid for it, and it belongs to the whole community. And you're not a college professor. You have a license to teach a subject. I was licensed in secondary English. I was licensed in secondary guidance, and I was licensed in elementary ed through 8th grade. And that's basically it. So I wouldn't presume to try to teach chemistry and a lot of teachers, there's a great article out today by Robert Condicio about this social emotional learning. A lot of these teachers also seem to think not only that they're college professors, but they're also therapists. And they're asking kids really inappropriate questions that are way beyond the purview, not only of the class, but of their training and their licensure and their ability. And I know enough as a trained school counselor to know never ever do this, because these are not your children. They haven't consented to treatment. You're not qualified to treat them. You don't know what you're going to unearth. So they're giving them, these survey instruments. I've had a couple of people reach out this week. Apparently the thing going around right now are these identity wheels, where you're supposed to list the various aspects of your identity, and then the schools collect this information. And what are they going to do with it? Okay, you know that this kid is Jewish and straight, and what their ethnic background is. And I don't know why a teacher has been tapped to collect this information. I don't know what they're going to do with it. But if you're talking about group counseling, basically, which is one of the hardest counseling situations that there is, there's supposed to be informed consent. Like, what do you intend to do to this group of students? Kids are minors. They can't even give consent. Their parents haven't consented to treatment. And you're not licensed to treat anybody. So why don't you just stick to teaching English or math or social studies or whatever it is instead? Social emotional learning was the topic that Robert Condicio was writing on. I'm really glad someone has written about this, because this is one of the side doors. And suddenly teachers all seem to think that they're therapists of some sort. Well, they're not.
When you were talking earlier about the aspect of secret keeping from parents, so, talking about things or teaching things in school that they weren't informing parents about, and that being, a pretty serious thing, it reminded me that, that's what they're doing in schools around gender identity. And I don't think this is something that you cover per se, but like, there's a thing that's going on in American and Canadian schools where they'll essentially socially transition kids without telling their parents. So they'll start calling them by a different name and using the pronoun attached to the opposite sex, and telling the other students, this boy is now a girl and you have to refer to him as such, which is and you mentioned grooming earlier, and to me that it is grooming, and that's really dangerous because you're really messing with kids' heads. First of all, like you're injecting this very particular, like really faith-based ideology into these kids' brain. You're confusing them about their bodies and biologies, and you're potentially putting them on a path to like taking hormones and getting surgeries somewhere down the road.
Yep. And then some teachers, to their credit, have come forward and said, my school, they call those gender plans. And, I've seen a few of those going around, and it's like, here's the name the child is to be called at the school. But when you talk to the parents, you are to refer to them by their given name. To think that they are sort of superseding parental authority, which is very well established in our law and in our culture. And I'm very pessimistic this week. If you had caught me another week, I would have been more optimistic, which is what I aim to be. But this week I feel like the whole education system is really breaking down because such a betrayal of trust. And these teachers are saying, you're putting me in a situation where, first of all, how do you, it's like that old saying, what a tangled web we weave when first we seek to deceive. You have to remember, how soon will it be before a teacher accidentally blurts out the wrong name to a parent and it's exposed? And it's already being exposed. It's happened, and these things have shown up online. And there are teachers who quite understandably don't want to be placed in this position. I'm supposed to, they don't want to lie to the parents about what's going on at the school. And this sounds to me like it's going to have to go to the unions, if nothing else. Like, you have to protect me from being asked to do things that violate my conscience.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, part of the problem is that there's a particular political bias, it sounds like, on the parts of teachers, both in, high schools and in colleges and universities. So there's far more leftists or progressives, whatever you want to call them, now who are teaching in universities and high schools than there are people on other ends of the political spectrum, which is having a really big impact on the kinds of ideas and politics and ideologies that are being taught to kids.
And it's to the point where I go back and forth between being really angry at many of these teachers, many of whom are younger, and feeling sorry for them because I think some of them have honestly never been exposed to competing ideas. And it just leads to mental weakness, the same way that you're not going to develop strong muscles if you never have any opposing weight to train against. All day long, your body is in opposition to gravity, and that's what helps your bones and your muscles to be strong. But if you are only ever fed pablum in schools, which is just like, let me give you this pre-chewed narrative, and all you have to do is just, eat the baby food instead of having to actually chew on something tough and work it out for yourself. I mean, we have two hemispheres of our brain for a reason. And the ideological imbalance in higher education has now filtered down to K-12. And these teachers are not, I don't think, equipped to grapple with opposing ideas. And they also are learning tactics, of shaming kids and labeling kids, humiliating kids. Like I just described the teacher who said, don't oppose me or I'm just going to make fun of you in class, which, there used to be a term for that, which was called bullying. And there used to be this whole huge anti-bullying campaign in schools, but now we're hearing that kids just feel bullied by their teachers, and suddenly it's somehow acceptable. Our president at FIRE, Greg Lukianoff, put together 10 principles for empowering the American mind. And the first one is no compelled speech, thought, or belief in the classroom, which has been, this is written into law. This is West Virginia versus Barnett. This is the famous flag salute case where it was Jehovah's Witnesses who felt that it violated their religious faith to stand and salute something they didn't. I think they felt it was like a graven image, right? And so, it is actually because of Jehovah's Witnesses that we have a couple of our First Amendment protections. And they're talking about making kids, it's not just even that you have to hear these views, which in many cases violate the morality that is being taught at home, But kids are pretty much expected not just even to affirm these, basically agree with them, but in some cases even enact them, because they will do an action week and we're all going to protest in favor of this, or we're going to march in favor of that. And you don't have a choice. One of the weirdest stories I know at FIRE, my first year at the Foundation for Individual Rights and Education, is a student wrote to me because they were having a walkout. And this was the walkout, the March for Our Lives. And it was essentially in favor of gun control. And this student said, but I don't support this cause. And I told them I don't. And it was supposed to be students were going to skip school for this cause. And they were going to take their punishment to show how strongly they believed in this cause. Well, in this case, the school decided all the kids were going to march out and walk for this cause. And one student, one dissenter said, but I don't agree with this cause. I don't want to march for it. And the school said, well, you have to, because we don't have anyone to supervise you, because the whole school, the teachers, the administration, we're all walking out. And he said, but I don't believe in this. So their solution was that they said, well, we're just going to walk around the track in a circle, which is a very silly exercise, in my opinion, anyway. But this is what they were going to do. So they said, well, you can just stand in the middle of the track and we will walk in a circle around you. That was their suggestion to him. And, can you think of anything more terrible?
And what, like point and heckle?
Yeah, the implication was pretty clear that you were going to be an object of, if not just ridicule, perhaps targeted for corrective action. And I told him to tell his guidance counselor that this is like, I'm not doing this. And she put an end to it. So at least there was a sane person in the school. So yeah, I mean, this is what these are the great ideas that they're coming up with. In my daughter's school, another activity every Tuesday, they had a diversity club, and it was student run, and it just turned into this Lord of the Flies situation where they would put the whole school in the the auditorium and in a circle. And so you're all looking at one another, and then they would talk about a cause, and they'd be like, stand up if you support this cause. Well, guess what happened to you if you didn't stand up? Back then the causes were things like Occupy Wall Street is the one that I seem to remember. And if you didn't stand up, so you kind of had this Hobson's choice. It's like, okay, either say you don't agree with Occupy Wall Street. You either stand up and are a liar to yourself in public, or you don't stand up. And then what would happen? The other students would come and find you at your locker later in the day and teach you a lesson for having exposed your willingness to be an individual.
I mean, it's you said like that these teachers aren't equipped to contend with opposing opinions, but I think it's also that they don't want to because they're totally self-righteous about their opinions. What's happened, and this has happened culturally, not just in schools, of course, is that so-called progressive opinions and progressive politics are just positioned as right. And anything anywhere else, on the right, conservatives, libertarians, actual liberals, that's positioned as the wrong and bad and dangerous and harmful opinion. When did this change in terms of education, in the classroom? When did the leftist or progressive perspective start to be viewed as the right perspective? And when did it become acceptable for the classroom to become a really political space?
I think that this has been incrementally encroaching on education for decades. I think that this is a low-grade chronic situation that suddenly became acute, kind of like, you could have a chronic health condition that there's a precipitating crisis. And I think in this case, the precipitating crisis was George Floyd. And I guess that happened for some reason, I'm thinking March. It might have been in the summer. And teachers came back that fall primed. But the interesting thing is suddenly a bunch of different prepared curriculum materials were implemented very aggressively. And these curricular materials didn't come from nowhere. They were already prepared. So some of them, the complaints I've heard were, I have heard a lot of complaints about Southern Poverty Law Center's Teaching Tolerance curriculum, which has renamed itself. I think it might be Teaching Justice now. There's a lot of deceptive terminology that's also being used. A lot of parents sort of look the other way because who wants to be against justice or equity or social justice or fairness or terms that sound benign, but you have to look at what this actually means on the ground. The other curricular materials that suddenly were being adopted were the 1619 Project, and also there are curricular materials with Black Lives Matter. And some of these, so one of the signs that this might be going on in your school is that your kids are bringing home a lot of worksheets instead of textbook materials. So they're sort of going out of the books that have been adopted by the schools, downloading content. And then, I would recommend that parents check their kids' backpacks to see what's coming home, and check the lesson plans, which in a lot of schools are posted online. And a good thing that came out of COVID was there was a lot more oversight by parents, and they were very shocked. And I actually find it, again, fascinating that teachers who knew they were on camera were willing to do these things. So I guess which again, it's like either they don't know any better, they never learned any different. I think we're coming into a generation now, because this is a longstanding problem, of teachers who were not taught the way you and I were taught. And now we're reaching a point where they don't have any other model to refer to other than just indoctrinating, by which I mean inculcating a doctrine, like a dogma, a dogmatic worldview, this one lens. And there's just this hyper focus right now on race, gender, not so much class. Race and gender are the two things right now, and everything is interpreted through this lens. And it's not only monomaniacal, but it's just darn boring, and the kids are getting sick of it. They're just marinating in it. They're swimming in it. And you don't even have to there's this old joke about Sunday school, and the child's like, I don't know, whatever the question is, the answer is Jesus Christ. So whatever the question is in school nowadays, the answer is racist, that's racist, this is racist, everyone's a racist. And I'm pretty sure that the real world is much more nuanced than that.
Well, and you're right, 'cause it isn't interesting. And it's not interesting because you're just repeating mantras or you're repeating buzzwords. You know what the response is supposed to be. And it's just supposed to be these words that we say over and over and over again, to the point that they've really lost meaning. And it's just, again, it's, repeat after me. So you say, systems of oppression, or you say intersectionality, or you say diversity or inclusivity, or systemic racism, or whatever, something about a gendered binary or fluid gender, something like that.
Right. Like Sunday school, say Jesus Christ, you can't be wrong. And so, they just repeat these things mindlessly. And I also, there's some Marxism embedded in all of this, which is also not transparent. And I like to point out that they're really good at pointing out power and oppression dynamics between men and women, or white people and black people, or the rich and the poor, or English speakers and non-English speakers. But they really are blind to the fact that I can't think of a wider power differential than between an adult and a child, or between a teacher and a student. Think of the power that the classroom teacher has over that student in the classroom. And here they are lecturing them and expecting them to affirm their teacher's worldview. And they're oblivious to the fact that you control this student's discipline. You can punish this child. You have the right to do that, and they have no right to speak against you. You can keep them from using the bathroom. You can affect their life chances, or whether or not they can get into college at all. And you are the one giving them a lesson about abuse of power. I think that teachers need to be more mindful of using their power with discretion, and recognizing who the powerless people in the classroom really are.
Right. And I mean, it sounds like there's a problem with the way that teachers are being trained now, which tells me that this must be coming. I mean, I don't know, maybe there's something else going on also, but it seems like probably a lot of this in any case is coming from the university. So when teachers go to learn how to be teachers, when they go into education and they do that program, they must be being taught all of these political ideas, that it's appropriate to inject these political ideas into their student, and that they're doing good in terms of doing this. And that's what teaching is.
I have no doubt that these teachers think that what they are doing is a good thing. I would not question that. I think that they will probably look back and realize that they are doing more harm than good, some of them as they mature. But definitely the ed schools are a big part of the problem. And probably the best authority on that in the country is a professor named Lyle Asher, who wrote in a column, an article in the Chronicle of Higher Education called How Ed Schools Became a Menace. But the imbalance in ed schools is about as bad as any, probably among the very worst in academia. It's almost a complete monoculture at this point. And the premier ed school in the United States is Teachers College at Columbia. And if you go online and look at the curriculum there, you are going to see courses that are almost all marinated in Marxism and in political ideology, and virtually none of them, if you look at them, will tell you anything about how a teacher is going to learn how to teach a child how to read, how to write, how to do math. It's all about embedding power and oppression dynamics, which is always, in the Marxist realm. And I'm not opposed to having American students learn something about Marxism, but there's a huge difference to learning about something and learning in a pedagogy that is coming from that lens. And of course, American students should be learning more about non-Marxist systems, because those are the systems that operate our culture, our economy, our government, and they certainly need to learn something about those as well. I mean, it's called critical pedagogy, and it's a criticism, but a criticism is a criticism of something, and all kids are just getting nothing but criticism. It's like getting a review, like a bad review of a movie, and never seeing the movie for yourself. That's how tilted it's gotten. And certainly the criticism should not take up more curricular space than the thing being criticized, which is everything about our culture and our history that kids are supposed to be learning about.
Right. And I mean, you talk about in the book how criticism has replaced celebration. So, there's an overemphasis on criticizing, literature and texts and so on and so forth. And I guess not appreciating any of that literature, those texts.
Yeah, and I went to grad school. I actually dropped out of, you asked when I first was exposed to this problem, and I would trace it back to the early 90s. And then I just recognized it when it came up again. But I was in an English PhD program, and believe it or not, most of this ideology in K-12 now had its origins in the humanities, which you wouldn't think, because you don't think of the humanities as being, well, maybe you do, political. They really, really are. And so critical theory was a literary theory that there's a joke that ran around the internet that critical theory leaked from a lab in a humanities department, kind of like the COVID, the coronavirus supposedly leaked from a lab. But yeah, I mean, I really went to graduate school hoping to learn how I really admired many of the great works of literature. And I thought I would like to learn how to become a great writer. And maybe if I went to grad school in English, naive me, they might teach me how to be a great writer. But all we did was criticize and tear these works apart. And first of all, I didn't feel qualified to do that. I'm like, I'm not better than, Chaucer or Tolstoy or Dickens. I admire what they're able to do. And at that time, it was critical feminist theory. So we were just supposed to look at the book and say, well, that was written by a white man, and therefore it's bad. And I just thought, well, this is so stupid. I'm not going to do this. And I left. And now, you're supposed to, now it's critical race theory, and maybe it'll be critical gender theory next, or maybe it already is. But I didn't learn anything about how to be a great writer, but I learned how to show disdain for other people's writing.
Well, yeah, and that's become, again, like a cultural trend where these people, I mean, it always makes me sound like an old person when I say these young people, but it's true because it is a generational thing.
Yeah.
Sort of think that they're entitled to go around tearing down and canceling and criticizing people who have been doing whatever work they're doing for decades and decades and decades. So well-established writers and experts and scientists and academics and, you know, reporters and so on and so forth. And it's because this is what's being taught in colleges and universities now, where, you know, it's your job to attack, you know, in this case, these great classic writers. And then how are you going to learn how to be a good writer? I mean, the way that you would learn how to be a good writer is by reading to start, and then of course by writing yourself and probably getting edited and you know, and so on. You know, I'm a writer and I learned a lot from getting edited by people who were much more experienced than me at writing and editing, who were, you know, decades older than me. But these kids don't even know that they're not good, and they feel so entitled to go around attacking everyone else who's been, you know, working at this for however many years.
The interesting thing is that kids, you know, kids are normally developmentally supposed to be rebellious, but these kids very much want to please their teachers, and they're doing what they think will make their teachers happy, which is being these really negative, pessimistic critics of everything and just pounding that same hammer over and over again. But I would argue that, you know, kids need healthy doses, or at least balanced doses of optimism. And I don't think that this diet of critical pessimism is healthy for young people. And we see these rising rates of depression and anxiety. And I would argue that these are not unrelated. I just don't think it's what young people at the outset of their lives need. They need to, like, you're telling young people that a lot of minority parents are very upset about it, because they're like, stop telling my child that they're a victim and that the system is hopelessly stacked against them and that they're never going to be able to succeed because of systematic racism and systematic oppression. And I just don't think that this is adaptive in so many ways. And, you know, there's a great speech by Teddy Roosevelt where he says that it's not the critic who counts, it's the man in the arena. If you just Google Teddy Roosevelt, the man in the arena speech, it's like, it's the person who's actually writing, good, bad, or indifferent, who counts. And the critic is just sitting on the sideline, you know, throwing rocks. Well, you know, Winston Churchill once said, you'll never get anywhere if you stop, you know, every time a dog barks to throw stones. It's just, I don't think it's healthy.
Yeah, and I mean, there was a term that you mentioned. You were quoting someone named Nathan Hoffman, who I wasn't familiar with prior, who uses the term illiterate revolutionaries, which are, you know, kind of being created by this kind of approach. Can you talk more about what that term means?
Yeah, that's a short video by Eli Steele, and he's basically saying that we are creating a generation of revolutionaries, which is very much in the Marxist mindset, who don't know anything about their history or what they're rebelling against. So they're very adamant about being upset and, you know, basically wanting to tear down the system. But if you ask them to describe the system that they're tearing down, they would be illiterate and ignorant of what they're actually against. So, yeah, I mean, and not to put too fine a point on it, but there is a term for people who promote. I know you were raised in a Marxist household, but, you know, the term for people who unwittingly promote Marxist ideology, you might know what that is. It's useful idiot, right? So that's not, nobody, don't be that. You know, at least if you're going to be a Marxist, be an informed Marxist and know what it is. Because, like, if you want to criticize the capitalist system, like to give an example, I had to teach. This is an argument that we sometimes hear, is that critical race theory. Now we have bans. 26 states have proposed bans on teaching critical race theory because of the level of disruption it's causing in society. They consider it divisive, unhealthy, and all these, you know, other problems. And then people are saying, well, this is just like evolution. And, you know, and then there's trying to equate people who are opposed to critical race theory. I'm not opposed to kids learning about it. I am opposed to kids being expected to affirm it. I also don't think that it's age appropriate. I think it maybe belongs in the colleges and universities, but not necessarily in K-12, because I think it's very esoteric and that kids take all the wrong messages because they're not sophisticated enough to fit it into the realm of other theories. They don't have the full breadth. But in terms of the relationship to evolutionary theory, I've had to teach that as a developmental psychology adjunct professor, which I was for over 14 years, I think 17 years total. And I would always approach it this way because, I would sometimes have Mennonites in the classroom where I live, and I would say, okay, now we're going to go over the natural selection and Darwin. We're going to talk a little bit about Jean-Baptiste Lamarck and acquired adaptation and how traits, are acquired through heredity. And I said, and you're going to have to know it because it's going to be on the test, but you don't have to believe it. But you will be accountable. And I said, but anyway, if you don't believe in it, you're going to want to know what it is you don't believe and why. So I don't have a problem with, I'm not a Marxist, but I don't mind my daughter reading the Communist Manifesto. But to present that as a lesson with nothing about capitalism in America is a sham of a lesson. That you should be reading The Wealth of Nations, an excerpt from The Wealth of Nations by Adam Smith when are kids ever taught the theory behind capitalism in American schools? You're just expected to absorb it by osmosis. But in most cases, it's harder to see the system you live in because it's invisible to you. It's like a fish in water. A fish doesn't know it's in water because it's all that it knows. Whereas immigrants come to this country having escaped other systems that, have maybe impoverished their families, and they can more easily perceive the benefits of our systems. And they often outperform American students who instead are steeped in pessimism and criticism.
Yeah, and I think a big part of the problem is that students aren't learning the history anymore. I think they learn modern theory, which I guess is meant to be a response to this history, a response to the history of oppression, et cetera, et cetera. But, so I was in women's studies. I did a BA and a master's degree in women's studies, which then, of course, became gender studies, not women's studies anymore.
Right. That's
and you don't really, it was bad then and it's much worse now, but you don't really learn, there's not a focus on women's history. So you don't learn very much about what happened during the first and second waves. You learn modern theory, you learn modern gender theory. And what happens then is that, it's created third wave feminism, which is essentially a backlash to second and first wave feminism. And you have this whole generation of young women who think that feminism is about hating on feminism, that feminism is about hating on the women's rights movements of yesteryear, which actually accomplished something, like the, first and second wave feminism achieved all these like legislative and policy changes that these women are now benefiting from, including access to education and access to careers that they didn't have access to, laws against sexual harassment in the workplace, laws against marital rape, obviously the ability to vote and participate in the public sphere in politics. But all they learn is this criticism. Like, this is just a bunch of like white ladies from 100 years ago, and therefore they're bad.
Well, in terms of perspective, that's another reason I dropped out of my English PhD program, because at the time, the predominant theory was deconstructionism and postmodernism. And we weren't reading, literally at that time, the argument was you could just as easily read a restaurant menu as read War and Peace. They are equivalent. Which is, a very extreme argument to any common. Exactly, it's laughable. And I remember fighting with one of my instructors and saying, look, this just isn't really working out for me. And he said, well, we're deconstructing the canon. The canon would be the group of great works that people have historically read. And I said, well, can I learn the canon first before I deconstruct it? Because I said, that might be very interesting for you who already had the opportunity to learn the canon. But you're not looking at it from the perspective of us, the students. And a lot of what's going on is that teachers are teaching what is interesting to they themselves, which is more acceptable at the college level where professors get to specialize. But at the K-12 level, it's not about you, the teacher, it's about the students and what is best for them at their developmental level. And just because you're interested in third wave feminism or critical race theory or whatever, now it's culturally responsive pedagogy or whatever the latest thing coming down the pike is, doesn't mean that that's what your students necessarily need. And it's all about, teachers are heroes, like you said earlier. If so, then it would be because they put the needs of other people ahead of their own. But what I'm seeing are teachers who are basically utilizing kids to gratify their own academic interests. And I don't think that's why you're paid a salary. You are paid to do a hard job, which is to teach young people things which are oftentimes very, very boring to yourself, but necessary.
Right. And I think in some ways to sort of reinforce that notion that they're doing something good for the world in teaching so-called social justice, which I think in many contexts is the purpose of social justice. Like a lot of these buzzwords that we mentioned earlier don't really accomplish anything beyond just making the person saying it feel good about themselves because they're repeating these words that are, somehow good for the world.
It's very ego gratifying. A fire actually fought a successful battle against the NCATE, which is I think the National Council National Council of Accreditors of Teacher Education, and they put in dispositions, and this is where it gets creepy, where they want to, this is, Americans, we have freedom of conscience. This is where your freedom of speech rights come from. You have the right to think what you think, Megan. I have the right to think what I think. And traditionally, we were very live and let live. I might try to persuade you, but I would never try, attempt to coerce you into agreeing with me, which is the realm we're heading into. And these dispositions said that new teachers had to show that they had a social justice disposition, which is very scary because it implies that you must think a certain type of thought in order to become a teacher. And it really reaches inside, the very atoms of your individual liberty and says, which is not what we do in a free society. Fire fought that because your idea of what is just probably comes from your upbringing or from the religious tradition you were either raised in or that you've chosen to join. And it's a very personal thing. And to say that I must agree with somebody else's opinion, I mean, we all have to adhere to the law, which represents sort of a collective agreement on justice. But social justice is something altogether different. It gets into that realm of maybe deceptive terminology where it sounds very nice, but it might be embedding some notions that a lot of very principled people might disagree with. And fire was successful in fighting that. But this is a battle that continually has to be refought. And it comes back with a different terminology to represent the same idea. But ultimately, it's about you will conform to what I see happening is a second morality that is very much in conflict with traditional morality that is being smuggled into our schools, packaged in a certain way, and parents are wising up to it. And some parents might agree with it, and that's fine, but let's be open and transparent about what we're talking about.
Right. And that you're right. That term social justice does sound good. And so it's easy to assume that if you say, social justice in the curriculum or social justice approach, that would be a good thing, about contributing to a more equitable or more just world. But you're critical of that term.
Well, that and other terms, like the term this year has started off as anti-racist, which it sounds very good, but it embeds a lot of some assumptions, and there are a lot of sunk premises that are not openly discussed. And suddenly a lot of very concerning ideologies are imported into the classroom, and then people who oppose them are labeled as racist, whereas a lot of parents are standing up now. What's been really heartening to me this year, it has been the number of parents who are standing up, almost to the point where it's getting a little out of hand. But regardless, there has been a lot of fear about standing up. But yeah, they're calling people racist who are not anti-racist, but the term anti-racist incorporates a lot of worldviews and morality that people consider to be racist. And it sort of manifests as the difference between the Martin Luther King ideology that I would like my children to be judged not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. Whereas this new ideology is judging people by the color of their skin. And I was just talking to a student who's at NYU, and she said that when she was in high school, in a boarding school, they, on Martin Luther King Day of all days, they were actually put in different rooms according to the color of their skin. And I laughed and I said, well, but couldn't they have organized you according to the contents of your characters? Which is obviously less visible. But she just, even at that age, she was 14, and she's like, something's wrong. But she's like, I couldn't articulate it then. So now she's very interested in this topic, because you just feel in your bones that this violates your ethics or your worldview. And, families have a right not to have the morality that they're teaching at home undermined in a secular school. If you choose to send your kid to a Catholic school, you shouldn't be surprised that they're going to teach them Catholicism. But if you send your kid to a secular school and you're a Catholic, you will be very upset to find that they are undermining the Catholic religion. If and there is a case right now in Nevada where the child in a public school who happens to be biracial was told he's going to need to unlearn his Judeo-Christian upbringing in class. And that is one of the stated arguments in the case. You don't get to do that. And I'm so boggled at any teacher who thinks that that is their role in the classroom.
Mm-hmm. I mean, and so part of what's going on now is that there's all these diversity programs and like anti-racism trainings. And this is happening in the corporate world, but it's also happening in schools. I wonder how much money is being spent on, bringing people in to do anti-racism training, or to, teach teachers and other members of the faculty about diversity and how they're supposed to approach these issues now, things like race and gender, for example.
Yeah. I would say billions of dollars are being spent. I know that in certain school districts, parents have filed FOIA requests, Sunshine Law requests, to find out how much. And I've seen numbers like ranging in the 400,000s for 1 year's worth of trainings. And then these seem to be going on. I from what I hear, and mind you, I realize I'm marinated in this stuff, but I kind of wonder, is there a school in America that remains that has not yet had diversity training? It's a very unregulated industry. And in some cases, it's veering into this unlicensed therapy. Teachers are supposed to be, teachers are public school licensed by the state, the same way that a doctor or a lawyer is. And the reason is because they're in a position to do harm to vulnerable people. In this case, the most vulnerable people, children. And so there's a reason why we do that. And then they let in the side door these consultants who are not licensed, who are suddenly put in front of children. I don't think parents usually have a very full understanding of the type of training that is imparted, that the training that the trainers received, what ideology, what philosophy underlies it. A lot of the problems that we're seeing is really at the philosophical level, which is hard to interpret and hard to perceive, but people are figuring it out. And again, it usually embeds a worldview that is oftentimes antithetical to American founding traditions.
Right. So tell me a bit more about that. What's being taught in these training sessions?
Well, some of these training sessions are themselves the subject of lawsuits. So, concepts like white privilege and whiteness as a construct, and whiteness as a harmful construct. And I know that there's a case out of Evanston, Illinois, with a teacher who is objecting to it. There's this book that has caused a lot of controversy called I think it's called Whiteness, Not My Idea. And so some of this training is taught to teachers, and then they're expected to pass it on to students. But the objections tend to fall in the civil rights realm, where basically, I'm allowed to have a job, and at my job, I should not be persecuted or targeted because of my race, because of my gender, because of my religion, because of my all of those categories of protected classes. And then you have teachers who are told that your race is a problem, and they're shamed and they're labeled. And then this becomes a violation of their civil rights protections. And so there are lawsuits that are proceeding right now, and I know of at least two. And typically it is white people being targeted and labeled and shamed because because of the color of their skin or their ethnicity, their backgrounds.
Right. And I think that what would be argued would be that it's a way to right historic wrongs. So in an American context, it would be, they would say, well, white people enslaved and oppressed black people and other people of color were oppressed in America and in Canada. And so we have to correct all this horrible history that we have.
Well, yeah, that is the argument. That's the justification for doing it. The problem is that people have civil rights protections and they are asserting them in court cases. And I think they have some pretty strong counter arguments, and we're going to see which prevails in court. I don't think that people lose civil rights protections because they are a certain race. But essentially, what you're describing is the equality argument. We're all equal and should be treated equally, versus the equity argument, which is that in order to correct historic wrongs, some people should be treated unequally. And we have a system of laws that derive from a certain worldview, and this is a different competing worldview. So I mean, there's a reason why critical race theory comes out of the law schools. But our system of laws is very much rooted in Enlightenment traditions, which is grounded in Judeo-Christian, the Judeo-Christian worldview, and that's what our founding documents were written in. And people are very much taking aim at all of these foundations. And so I just think we need to be very clear about what we're talking about and what we're attempting to undermine here, because I think that there is more good than bad in this country, and I think that our Western civilization traditions are worth defending.
Right. And I mean, it does make sense that there would be some kind of harm in teaching people that they can't escape an oppressed status, for example. I mean, I know, like, I grew up working class and I came from a Marxist family. So I grew up thinking, and class does have an impact. It is hard to escape class. It's obviously much easier to make money if you have money, if you have access to property, if your father or grandfather is handing down his lucrative company to you, or you're getting an inheritance. And if you grow up working class, you don't have access to any of those things, and you do have to struggle a lot more to make more money, or to be able to buy property, or to get out of that class status. But at the same time, I did grow up thinking that I couldn't escape the working class, so there was no point in trying. I was never going to own property. I was never going to have any money, because if you're working class, you're stuck in the working class. So I can see that same kind of argument being applied to, I don't like the term people of color, but this is the term that social justice activists use. So I'm using that term, that, all people of color can't escape their oppressed status. All white people have privilege over them, and there's nothing that anybody can do about that.
Right. Well, I mean, I think that America has many opportunities for people of all races and colors. I do think that there are some embedded systems of unfairness, and I didn't grow up, extremely affluent, so I can totally relate to your experiences. But I can't think of anything that could become more of a self-fulfilling prophecy than to tell kids who are at the bottom of the pecking order. Like, I very much believe in meritocracy, in the concept of effort and achieving something. And sometimes having a lot of things handed to you is not always the gift that you think it is. I don't believe in encouraging young people to develop a system of resentment, because I think that the best outcome will come from building optimism and training, not training kids, but helping kids to develop themselves as take, I was taught as a teacher that you want to take kids where you find them as far as you possibly can. And that means if a kid comes to you and he can't even read, that's okay. You accept them as they are. And hopefully by the end of the year, you have traveled a long distance together. And some of life's greatest satisfactions come from overcoming difficult odds. And so for every case of a kid who, didn't achieve, there are many, many cases of people who overcame difficult odds and did achieve amazing things in spite of it. And there are many examples of rich kids who, became drug addicted losers and, had no purpose in life, had no meaning in life. So there's this story about, the alcoholic father, and he has two sons, and one of them becomes really successful and one of them becomes, a drug addicted alcoholic like his father. And they ask them, well, how did you end up this way? And they both say, well, look at my father. So, the theory in counseling, in, like positive psychology, is it's not what happens to you, it's what you think about what happens to you. So, the person can grow up in a very poor household with a lot of odds against them, and that becomes the motivation for them to succeed. That being said, I totally recognize that many, many people have way more money than I'll ever have. And, there's nothing I could do to make it equal. But I do think that if you think inequality is bad, try forced equality if you want to see some human misery.
Well, and I mean, there's countless stories of achievement in America, for example, of people who came from extreme hardship and who succeeded, including the Irish. Um, but
Yeah,
also,
I'm Irish too. Yeah.
it's a good story. I mean, it's
Good
not a good story. There's definitely a lot of bad parts to that
See
story.
my bagpipes right behind me.
Right, of course. And, and I think that it is true that, I mean, hardship can be a good thing, and struggle and overcoming and understanding that there are things
But let's
that you
not
can.
romanticize it. I know.
No, I mean, it's hard, but
Yeah.
it's not, I don't think I would want a life without hardship. I mean, I don't think that that's something that necessarily benefits you, at least psychologically.
Right.
But, I think that understanding that you can do things to take control of your life, and that you do have to work hard to succeed for the most part. I mean, there are people who haven't had to work hard at all and are successful, but I don't think that necessarily builds a lot of self-confidence, to be honest. I mean, the people who are most respectable, I think, and who have the greatest ethics and work ethic and approach to life and approach to the world around them, I think, are people who've gone through hard things and overcome. And that's an important lesson.
Yeah, and I think that there is a decadence that sometimes appears, among the extremely affluent that perhaps manifests itself in some of these ideologies that seem kind of self-loathing and deprecating, and to some way there's this Freudian term of reaction formation, and I kind of see some of that going on as well. So I do think there's white guilt involved in some of this, and it's a little harder, I think, when you're Irish to have that because of the background.
Because you're like,
And
no, that's not how this went down.
exactly. And so, yeah, and I mean, my family was Black Irish, so, for whatever that's worth. But I don't believe in encouraging, yes, I have so much sympathy for kids who are hard luck stories, but for their best outcomes, I believe in encouraging them and building them up and, preparing them to succeed in the system that we have that is not perfect, but I do believe is better than pretty much every other system on earth. But of course, we need to have a safety net, and nobody should starve, and people need to, when they're sick, they have to have access to care and things like that. So I think, we want to cut off the most extreme at both ends. Obviously there's taxes on people who have incredibly high incomes, and there are safety net for people who are incredibly low incomes. But without the motivation, I think, from my perspective, the reason why Marxism has failed is because it fails to understand human motivation and human drive. And if you tell someone that the system is completely stacked against them, if you destroy their motivation, you've destroyed almost everything that gives them the will to get up in the morning. And it's the engine of prosperity. There's a reason why we have such a high level of prosperity and why we have a border control problem. And that's because we have a great engine, that produces wealth. And part of that comes from unleashing the human potential because of the inequality. The idea that if I work hard, I can make something of myself and I can get a little bit more. And that drives our creativity and leads us to unleashing our potential.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, it does have to have controls on it, because some people will be crushed in a pure meritocracy. So I don't think we have a pure meritocracy in America. And certainly there are some unfair systems, like I would argue legacy admissions to college, is not, obviously not meritocratic.
Right. So what advice would you give to parents who are concerned about what's being taught in school, or concerned about their kids being kind of indoctrinated into these particular ideologies, are concerned about their kids being taught things that they don't even know that they're taught, secrets being kept at school, and so on and so forth? Again, we talked about the gender identity transitioning thing that really disturbs me and worries me. What can parents do?
I would say, first of all, talk to other parents, because each of you has an ear to the ground, and you'd be amazed what the parent network knows about what's going on. Try to make a friend in a grade ahead of your children, because they'll tell you what's coming. They'll tell you which teachers are like this and other teachers are like that. Try to choose your child's teachers. I generally say, if you don't know, choose the oldest teacher available, because they're least likely to be steeped in this newer ideologies. If you don't like that, you're going to have to familiarize yourself with these ideologies. And I would say, some parents are pulling their kids out. Some will have to consider that, but I realize not everyone can. I recommend supplementing. So if you know that your child is not getting a balanced diet, that's a fair representation of the whole range of views. I do provide at my website, undoctrinate.org, on the blog, I provide suggested supplementary materials so that your child can learn about our legal system, and why we have the presumption of innocence, what due process means, why it's individual, not collective or group justice. That's another argument they're making: group justice, not individual justice, individual responsibility. That's very concerning. So I would recommend that you supplement. And but if you have a choice of schools, caveat emptor, let the buyer beware. And go to school board meetings, and maybe form groups to go to school board meetings. I realize parents can't go to every school board meeting, but if you have a group of 5 of you, that means you'd only have to go every sixth meeting, or every fifth meeting rather, so that you can keep each other apprised of what's being recommended. So sunshine is the best disinfectant. Make sure you are clear and the school is being transparent with you.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned FIRE, which is an organization that you're involved with earlier, which is the Foundation for Individual Rights and Education. Could you tell me just a bit more briefly about what FIRE is doing or trying to do?
Yeah, FIRE has been in existence for over 20 years, and we defend constitutional rights on college campuses. We are nonpartisan, and so if it's protected speech, we will defend students or faculty. We'll defend, if a speaker is invited and then is deplatformed, we do those sorts of cases. And at the K-12 level, we are just doing educational outreach to try and explain why free speech is an important value, and why it's important for kids to have the right to say what they honestly think and feel in order to have a quality education experience. So our website is thefire.org.
Thank you so much for speaking with me today. That was a really interesting conversation. I'm really glad that someone's doing this work. I know that there's not only you, but I appreciate this.
There are several parent groups across the United States that have formed as well. Parents Unite is one. Parents Defending Ed is another one. So we work with teachers as well. We provide curricular materials about free speech. that are nonpartisan, that are aligned with the standards that correspond. So we're not against teachers. We're for good teaching, and we want kids to learn these principles that the traditional ideas that underlie our democracy.
Great. And where can people find your book, which I'll just show everyone once again?
Yeah, I mean, Undoctrinate you can find at, I would say, Amazon.com, and it's been out since mid-September, and ironically, it reached #1 in radical thought, which I found hilarious because I can't think of anything less radical than suggesting that kids should not be indoctrinated in school. But apparently these days that's out
Into
there.
radical politics, I suppose. Okay, well, again, thanks for talking with me. I really appreciate your time.
My pleasure.
Okay, take care. Bye-bye.
Yeah, bye.